So now that the dust has settled on Slipknot's newest album, The End So Far, where does it rank among their discography? Or for that matter, where do any of their albums rank? My name's Connor from 905 Review. You might remember me from that Beginner's Guide to Slipknot video I did a little while back that so many of you enjoyed, which I am ever grateful for. Join me today as I'll be ranking the band's entire discography. I am so looking forward to hearing what you guys think of this list. But with that being said, which album has the distinction of being Slipknot's worst? For me, that would be All Hope Is Gone. The 2008 LP was Slipknot's fourth studio album, and it was their attempt at making their heaviest album yet. The recording process was quite different compared to their previous efforts, in that it was done in their home state of Iowa, and every member was very involved with it. This perhaps led to too many cooks in the kitchen because 9 guys all with their own unique ideas, there's bound to be some conflict. I don't feel bad ranking All Hope Is Gone here. A couple band members have called it Slipknot's worst as well. I find there's just not many standout tracks on here, and even the singles were pretty underwhelming to me. It took quite some time for me to come around to Psychosocial. That, Dead Memories, Sulfur, and All Hope Is Gone are all good, and maybe controversial of me, but honestly I don't really care much for Snuff. It's not a bad song, but a soft, tender, acoustic piece isn't what I have in mind when I'm planning to listen to Slipknot. Maybe even more blasphemous is that my favorite song on here is probably Gehenna, which I recall metal music publisher Loudwire ranking as the single worst song in Slipknot's entire discography. All Hope Is Gone felt like a cross between Volume 3 and Iowa, having the speed, heaviness, and edge, but also the bright melodies, clean vocals, and a lot of times what I'd call a commercial sound. I like that they recorded it at home, and it's uplifting to see frontman Corey Taylor's lyrics on persevering through the darkness he was in, growing more as a person, and just accepting himself for who he is. Even though it's the band's weakest, I'd still stamp this album with a B- grading. A lot of middle of the pack stuff here. Nothing too great. Coming in at number 6 then is the follow-up to All Hope Is Gone, Point 5, The Gray Chapter. This actually was my least favorite of the bands for quite a while, but with some more thorough listening and studying, it managed to jump up a spot. The Gray Chapter was of course their album dedicated to late bassist and founding member Paul Gray. It's understandably very difficult for a band to decide whether you want to continue on after something so tragic as this, but of course they would, with Alejandro Venturella filling in for him ever since. It was also the first with Jay Weinberg on drums, taking over for the departed Joey Jordison, who unfortunately has also passed since. His exit from the band always was a curious one, and it feels like more information is still coming to light on it. Matthew Sparks put out a fantastic YouTube video detailing the situation, and discovering that Joey was quite possibly still abusing drugs despite the band's new stance on it following Gray's overdose, it piqued my interest that some of the lyrics on this album could very well be about the drummer. So it's crazy the dynamic on this album. You've got songs mourning one brother, and then others potentially, and let's write that in all caps, potentially dwelling on harsh feelings towards another. I think The Devil and I, Lek, and The Negative One could all be examples of this. Going back to Paul, the album's opening and closing tracks, XX and If Rain Is What You Want respectively, are phenomenal tributes to him, whereas Skeptic unfortunately didn't win me over as much. I've read a couple comparisons of this album to Slipknot's early stuff, which, to be honest, I don't really hear, and frankly, I figured they relied too much on production on this album. You think the audibly modified vocals, the various additional sound they toss in outside of the band's usual instruments. Admittedly, that works for like the slower, atmospheric tracks, but on the faster paced rocking ones, there's already so much going on, so it just ends up being annoying or distracting. So Point 5, The Gray Chapter, also gets a B- from me. It's pretty hit or miss. I found it felt too long, and I don't know the significance, but I feel like the cover art is pretty weak. Well, what have we here? At the 5.5 spot, I'm sliding in Mate, Feed, Kill, Repeat. I'm adding it in here as a half point because, well, truly I don't really consider it an album. Hear me out. Mate, Feed, Kill, Repeat, coming out in 1996, a whole 3 years before their true debut, was entirely self-funded by the band, featured 4 songs that would be re-recorded for later albums, and a 5th that wasn't entirely redone but influenced the later track. And on top of that, only 3 of the members on here stayed in the band afterwards, being Paul, Joey, and fellow founding member Clown. That's right, no Corey Taylor yet, as at this point the band was still fronted by Andres Kulsefny, and you'll notice the guitars sound quite different too, as both Mick Thompson and Jim Root still had yet to be enlisted. Slipknot's self-titled album had many different influences that could be heard through it, and that only rings even more true here. Of course, there's all the metal and industrial. Unsurprisingly for the time, there was some rap, but even more so, they include some funk and border on disco. This can be a lot to take in across only 8 songs, 9 if you count the humorous hidden track Dogfish Rising, and even the lyrics are different from the Slipknot we know, as Clown and Kulsefny were very big on this role-playing game at the time called Werewolf the Apocalypse, where a lot of the lyrics on here derive influence from. I really like the opening track here, also titled Slipknot, which the end of gave influence to the self-titled album track Sick, and on top of that, the closing track Killers Are Quiet was an early, less polished version of Slipknot's killer song Iowa that would be released 8 years later. This too I'm giving a B- grading, and I'm probably being kind of lenient with it just because it is a demo more than anything in my eyes. And that being said, it is pretty good for what it is, just the variance in sound across this is way too large. So at number 5 on my board, I've got The End So Far. This is of course Slipknot's late 2022 album, thereby their newest one, and their last on longtime label Roadrunner Records. That being said, there were reports of Slipknot really wanting to branch out with their musical freedom, get weird with things, just kind of do whatever they want, even potentially ditch the whole idea of an album, and just having the liberation to drop individual songs or even EPs if they want. So the fact they still owed the label one more record for the deal to expire makes me wonder if that they just felt obligated more than anything to get this album done, because honestly, it did feel a little uninspired at times. The aforementioned interest in trying other styles is apparent right from the start of the album here. The opening track, Adderall, kind of caught me off guard with how laid back it feels between its soft piano and vocal melodies. And while I did like this song, I had some mixed feelings on it. It didn't really feel like a Slipknot song, and that's far from the only case on this album where I was conflicted. The single The Chapeltown Rag was released with 9 accompanying NFTs, which is pretty cringe, but each one contained a different little snippet of the song, so I guess they made it at least interesting. The 10th track, Hell, is written out in Leet speak, which is already pretty lame, but also way irrelevant now. The song Acidic is apparently an homage to 90s sludge metal band Acid Bath. I wouldn't have guessed it from the sounds of it. And you're treading on some thin ice, pal, because they're one of my favorite bands. I've alluded to the fact that I prefer my Slipknot tunes to be heavy, but I don't mind too terribly how they were experimenting and branching out on this record. At the same time, however, I'd argue The End So Far isn't as experimental as their previous effort, We Are Not Your Kind, and really fails to explore anywhere that album hadn't already. Despite how critical I might sound, I'm still giving this album a B grading. There's no real home runs, but at the same time, I can't say I really dislike any of these songs. At 4.5 now, that's right, we got another bonus entry. I've got Day of the Gusano live in Mexico. This is a live recording of Slipknot's first ever concert in Mexico, and one of the absolute highlights of this is the way that Corey Taylor interacts with the crowd in Spanish. It's just such a cool gesture, and I'm sure they loved and appreciated it. Being a show from 2015, it's got Venturella and Weinberg in the lineup, and the good thing about the timing is at that point the band had built quite the catalog, having their first 5 albums worth of songs to choose from. There's some great performances throughout the night, a couple lesser ones as well, even unfortunately on one of my favorite of the band's songs. Among the best were Psychosocial, The Devil and I, Duality, and Before I Forget, with the fans' enthusiastic involvement playing a big role in this. On top of this, the encore set of Sick, People Equals Shit, and Surfacing were all great hits as well. On the contrary, my lowest graded songs of the night were predominantly ones I already wasn't that big on in the first place, but man, I was disappointed in Wait and Bleed. One of the factors that was most evident throughout the show is that you can really hear the wear on Corey Taylor's voice. I can't imagine powering through a set with his ruthless singing style and what's in probably a boiling hot costume, no less. And then on top of that, you think about how he's been doing it for almost 2 decades at that point. It's just not feasible for that long. Regarding the rest of the band, the instruments sound incredible. The guitars are brutal in the best sense of the word, and while I've always been more of a Joey guy, I've got to give Jay his praise here because he was incredible throughout the entire show. I'm giving Day of the Gusano a B grading. Pretty good set list overall, pretty good performances overall, but hearing the band live and seeing the band live are night and day differences. At the real 4th spot, I'm putting We Are Not Your Kind. The 2019 release was the band's most artistic and experimental, which, going into blind for the first time, completely caught me off guard, though pleasantly I must add. Outside of trying all sorts of new things with their sound, they utilized interludes for the first time to really help maintain or progress the mood or tone of the album. With this in mind, they also keep from bloating the tracklist too much, utilizing lengthier songs, including a stretch of 4 6-minute songs to close the album with. We Are Not Your Kind gave us the hits Unsainted, Solway Firth, Birth of the Cruel, and Nero Forte, as well as one of my personal favorites, Spiders. This album gets a B grading from me. It's far from their heaviest, but I was so caught off guard and simultaneously impressed with the direction they went in, creating catchy, memorable choruses along the way, so I applaud them. While I previously dogged on the Grey Chapter for relying too much on production, the same could realistically be said for this album, except it just works this time on the band's most electronic release. Here we go. The final couple spots. Coming in at number 3, I have What Else? But Volume 3, The Subliminal Verses. Working with legendary producer Rick Rubin, whom band members have pretty differing opinions on working with, it finally saw them on the way up after the tumultuous creation process that was their second album, Iowa. As a result, it's got an overall softer sound than their previous 2 albums. That's not to say that Volume 3 doesn't rock out, but it does contain 2 acoustic songs, Circle and Vermilion Part 2. And I'd say many of these songs feel more radio-centric or commercially driven, maybe best exemplified by the fact that 3-0 is the only explicit song on here, and for a single use of the word hell. I mean, it was 2003, so nobody cared about them saying retarded in the chorus of Welcome. This did, however, help Slipknot reach even more mainstream success, as Volume 3 contained the hits Before I Forget, Duality, Vermilion Parts 1 and 2, and the crowd-dedicated anthem Pulse of the Maggots. With that being said, I think this album might be the best entryway for new Slipknot listeners. It's not too overwhelming, and at the same time you get a pretty good grasp for their overall sound and style. To elaborate a bit on this, it feels like guitarists Jim and Mick kind of take a bit of a back seat. They aren't roaming as freely as they were on the previous 2 albums, instead creating songs off these shorter, quick-paced, chugging guitar riffs. You think 3-0, Opium of the People, The Blister Exists, Welcome, maybe most notably Before I Forget with its go. You get the point. This is another release of theirs I'll be giving a B grading to. I wasn't too fond of the monotonous spoken word like vocal delivery on tracks like The Blister Exists, Vermilion, and honestly even Duality, but this did work for the slower, moodier track The Virus of Life. Giving the album credit where it's due, there really isn't one bad song on here, just not enough gems for me. So it all comes down to this. At number 2.5, I have 9.0 Live. While Day of the Gusano had the advantage of coming later in time, giving the band more songs to pick from, as a 2005 release, 9.0 selects from songs off the band's first 3 albums, which at this point you might be able to deduce were my 3 favorites of theirs. This 24-track compilation of selections from 8 concerts the band did between 2004 and 2005 features some of their biggest hits, fan favorites, no weak performances from the band in their prime. Taylor's voice is, of course, less polished live, but also less worn out than it was for Day of the Gusano. Also lost in this concert setting is the magic of their song Iowa, though it is still pretty awesome that they played it live. What does remain, however, or arguably gets even better, is the sound off the guitars with their harsh, cutting attitude. Another thing I like is that one of these tracks is a Joey Jordison drum solo, but the best part about this is that it's only 4 minutes long, so it's not too tiresome or obnoxious, and given that it's Joey, you're definitely getting your money's worth of notes crammed into that time frame. The most intriguing part of this album to me is that honestly, it's some of the songs that aren't even my favorites that they have the best performances of, as Purity and 3-0 were both exceptional. Additionally, the classic Duality was awesome, especially as the entire crowd gave it their all, and Corey was so impressed he used the end of the song as the opportunity to announce that Volume 3 had just been certified platinum. So Slipknot's first live album gets a B+ grading from me. It's a solid selection of songs and performances, but if anything, just makes me want to go see them instead. Okay, so for real this time. At number 2, I'm putting Iowa. The band's sophomore effort saw them rise to another level with its heaviness and sheer brutality, something the band members put themselves through hell to achieve. They had become popular so quickly thanks to their self-titled debut that the pressure to follow it up with something better was eating the band alive. The entire sessions were fueled by anger and hatred, even directed at one another sometimes. The end result is what many fans call the band's finest and heaviest work, and they let you know right off the bat what you're in for. The atmospheric intro, 515, an Iowa area code, features remixed cuts of turntablist Sid Wilson wailing after finding out his ill grandfather had passed just a day or two before he planned out to go visit him as he was busy working on the album. The previously mentioned hatred is right in your face on the second track, People Equal Shit, and it continues to flow throughout the entire album. Other popular songs here include Disaster Piece, as well as the singles The Heretic Anthem, Left Behind, and My Plague. Maybe it was that they doubled down and made a heavier album than their debut. Maybe it was that it was more technical or utilized more melody. Or maybe it was that they were already established at this point. Whatever the case, Iowa brought Slipknot to superstar status as the album went platinum, astonishingly, in just a little over a month and helped the band sell out multiple stadium shows. I had an odd realization when studying this album, and that is, to me, practically every song on here is either made or broken by its chorus. Disaster Piece, Everything Ends, New Abortion, and Metabolic are all ones I would say suffer from their choruses. Meanwhile, tracks like My Plague, Left Behind, and The Shape really benefit from having great ones. I also found a tendency to enjoy the more slow, eerie tracks on here, with Skin Ticket and Gently being among my favorites, as well as the album's title track being high above the rest. I mean, Iowa as a song, just the darkness and the atmosphere of it, it's so unsettling, and I mean the lengths the band went through to achieve it, it probably is the best song they've ever made. A lot of that can also be said of the album intro 515, though it is drastically shorter at a mere minute compared to Iowa at 15. I initially thought this album was good, but warmed up more to it over time, and even more during this analysis. And so I'm stamping Iowa with a B+ grading. While it's clearly not my number one album of theirs, I definitely see the appeal. There's tons of angst, and the songs go so hard. There's some catchy choruses on here, but again, it's really the ones I don't like that hinder this album from me, and realistically might be what keep it from being my number one Slipknot album. But alas, this of course leaves only one, no pun intended, Slipknot, the album that technically started it all. Not only is it my favorite of theirs, I'd say its cover art is their best as well. This psychotic 9-piece freak show is exactly what you're in for. And the title is fitting because for me and perhaps many others who saw this as their introduction to the band, this is Slipknot. The samples, scratching, rapping, clean melodic and harsh vocals, roaring, chugging guitars, as well as zany sporadic sounds from them, and of course the absolutely pummeling drums and percussion. It's the masks, the convict jumpsuits, all while being helped by nu metal legend Ross Robinson. The short, unsettling album intro perfectly sets up an all-time classic of theirs, Sick. And I mean, that followed by Eyeless and then Wait and Bleed, that's a legendary 3-song stretch we're talking about. Of course, not long after that is another classic, Spit It Out. This comes after Surfacing, which I'm not crazy about, but it is apparently the band's most performed song live, so it very well could be yours, in which case that ridiculous 3-song stretch then becomes an insane 5-song stretch. They clearly aren't afraid to be fast and frantic, but they can also bring in a grooving breakdown on a song like Eyeless or Liberate, and they also manage to fit in the slower, brooding tracks like Prosthetics or Scissors. So it's not hard to see why Slipknot had such a booming debut, standing out even amongst the alternative metal scene. And you think of the impact they've had on, I was going to say metal music, but you could say music as a whole over the past 25 years, and that all essentially starts here. While the album features such a wide range of influences, they're able to compress it all into one signature, singular sound and style, as opposed to Mate, Feed, Kill, Repeat, where it felt like they were jumping in a different direction on every song. Slipknot gets an A- grading from me as the band's best work, held back only by the occasional song like Only One or No Life. That has been my ranking of all the Slipknot releases. I am so looking forward to hearing your thoughts on it. Let me know what I got right. Let me know what I got absolutely wrong. And be sure to share your own personal lists. Can't wait to see it. As always, appreciate you being here and tuning in. You've been a blessing. You take care now. Until next time. That's all.